Well, hello and blessings to all. For those of you who haven't been with us, my name is Tim Gold, Minister of Education Administration at First Baptist Pell City, and welcome to this week's online lesson. Today, we actually start a new summer quarter with a new series of lessons in the Explore the Bible curriculum. We're going to be studying the book of Proverbs and Song of Songs, or Song of Solomon, as some interpreters have said. Now, today, we'll be looking at Proverbs chapter 1, and this week's lesson is entitled Charted Waters. Well, some first thoughts we have here is that the knowledge of God and the knowledge to live wisely are interrelated. Next to the knowledge of God and salvation, the knowledge to live wisely is the most important kind of knowledge. Godly knowledge is more than information, it's about transformation. You can be factually right, but at the same time you can be spiritually wrong. Now, Solomon's argument in the book of Proverbs is simple. Godly wisdom is applied truth that leads to transformation and wise, practical living. Some questions to consider as we begin the lesson. How would you describe the difference between knowledge and wisdom? How should information lead to a change in behavior? Good questions to consider as we start. Well, we'll set the context of Proverbs chapter 1. After King David died, Solomon and his son ruled for the kingdom of Israel for 40 years. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42. During his reign, he gained a reputation for being a wise king who comprised 3,000 proverbs. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 4, verse 32. In the introductory verses of the book of Proverbs, Solomon shared the benefit that comes to those who give serious attention to the proverbs in it. They would nourish an understanding of God's wisdom, enabling them to live with integrity and discretion. Nobody can ever grow past the godly wisdom that's in the Proverbs. Anyone who studies and meditates on them will consistently mature in discernment. The path leading to God's wisdom starts with a sincere relationship with Him that is marked by a healthy respect. Only foolish people would discard God's wisdom. Solomon then turned his attention to his son in chapter 1, verses 8 through 19. His son would need to live according to God's ways. He would need to make up his mind that he would walk in God's wisdom. Making that decision would not be easy, since he would encounter evil people who would try to entice him to join them. They would try to persuade him that the road they took would be fun, but it would involve violence, murder, and theft. Solomon warned that these evil ones would eventually have their lives stolen from them. Solomon went on to portray wisdom as an elegant woman in verses 20 through 33 of chapter 1. She would invite young people to listen to her, and she would speak to them as an authority figure who deserved their respect. If they listened, they could hear her calling out to them from above the noise of a foolish world. She would ask them to listen to her so that they would not take the path of foolish people. Such people would regret ignoring the wisdom she would have been glad to share. They had been given an opportunity to embrace God's wisdom, but didn't seem to be interested in it. They had their minds only on their own plans. In due time, trouble would come, but wisdom would not be there to help. They would be left to face the consequences of ignoring God's wisdom. By contrast, anyone who paid attention to godly wisdom would have no reason to fear as they faced their future. And that kind of sets the context for what we're going to be looking at now. Let's start out and look at verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is one of the most important verses in all the Proverbs. This verse serves as a lens through which Christians look deeply into the book itself. From the vantage point of this verse, the true source of knowledge comes into clear view. Another word for knowledge could be discernment. In the Old Testament world, knowledge bore a striking similarity to wisdom. Wise believers see things God's way so that they can do things God's way. Wisdom has a starting point. It begins with a relationship with the Lord, and growing in wisdom by walking with the Lord seems to be contrary to some of the popular notions about how someone becomes wise. For instance, some people believe that life experience cultivate wisdom, but without God's help, experiences themselves can lead a person to draw conclusions that might not be wise at all. Other people insist that age brings wisdom. They believe that the longer people live, the wiser they become. Granted, wisdom may come with age, but only if the years have been spent in a deepening walk with the Lord. That's got to be remembered and needs to be paramount in our thinking. Neither life experience nor long life guarantee wisdom. Wisdom comes from the Lord, who works in the experiences and through the years to show His people how to see things His way so that we can do things His way. Solomon directed the people of Israel to understand that a productive relationship with the Lord is characterized by fear. Fearing God didn't infer He terrorized them or made them dread the notion of being in His presence. Instead, fearing Him means respecting Him. Furthermore, their respect for the Lord would emanate from their love for Him. Solomon encouraged them to take their walk with the Lord seriously, as we need to do the same. A sincere walk with the Lord would allow their love for Him to be demonstrated in their respect for Him. Later in the book of Proverbs, Solomon reiterated the important connection between fearing the Lord and gaining wisdom. The psalmist, like Solomon, underscored the same connection. Psalm 111, verse 10. Job also pointed out the value of fearing the Lord. He declared that fearing the Lord was wisdom itself. You see that in Job chapter 28, verse 28. By contrast, fools have no use for God. They don't cherish the wisdom He can give. In fact, they despise it and they even ridicule it. Foolish people pass on the possibility of a fulfilling relationship with Him, and they turn their backs on His instruction. As a result, their foolish choices leave them unprepared to face the challenges that come every day, as well as the outcomes that will confront them in eternity. Throughout the book of Proverbs, the contrast between wisdom and foolishness will come into view quite often. The stark contrast will encourage believers to develop a deepening walk with the Lord and to seek His wisdom that comes from it. It will also nudge us to pray for people in our circle of relationships and influence who have made the foolish choice to reject Him. A couple of questions to consider at this time. When did you begin to realize that God would give you His wisdom? How often has He helped you choose a wise path? Good questions to consider as we continue to look at the lesson. Well, let's look at verse 8. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Well, Solomon began to instruct his own son. He may have been talking to Rehoboam, the son who would become the next king. You see that in 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 21. And Rehoboam would need to learn how to lead God's people when he took his father's place as king. He would need God's wisdom to rule well. For that reason, the sayings Solomon collected would be worth their weight in gold to him in due time. However, Solomon may have been referring to any of his other sons or to young men in general. The proverbs he collected would have been useful to any young person on the road to adulthood. By encouraging his son to hear, Solomon pointed to an important discipline for growing in God's wisdom. Hearing can sometimes involve little more than waiting for our turn to talk, as you see that way too much today. To truly hear, however, means to pay attention, absorb, interpret, and apply what's being said. God's wisdom comes to believers who learn the discipline of listening. Notice that Solomon urged his son to listen to his instruction. The worst decision his son could make as a young person would be to ignore or neglect it. Neglecting his father's instruction would lead him to forget it altogether. Solomon also directed his son to pay close attention to what his mother taught him. Proverbs 31 provides an excellent example of godly wisdom that a mother passed on to her son. You see this beginning in Proverbs 31, verse 1. Let's look at verse 9. For they are a graceful garland for your head and pendants for your neck. Now, having pointed to the need to take God's wisdom seriously, Solomon focused on the reward that awaited God's people who put it into practice. He highlighted the reward by comparing it to two items of clothing that signified victory and honor. The items of clothing people in Israel spoke volumes about their identity in the world. A garland placed on their heads signified that they had accomplished something very important. Perhaps they had won a race or some type of battle. The garland proclaimed their victory and honor that went with it. By connecting garland with seeking wisdom, Solomon assured his son that God would show him grace. God would be gracious to him as he lived in wisdom. Well, when we think about God's favor, we may be tempted to consider it a reward we must earn. But such flawed thinking ignores the wonders of God's grace. When we allow Him to grace us with the gift of His wisdom, we will display it in our lives. We wear God's gracious blessing of wisdom like a crown of victory and honor. In those days, Pendants likewise signified honor. For instance, Pharaoh placed a gold pendant around Joseph's neck. He wore the pendant to signify the honorable status he had been given. See that in Genesis chapter 41, verse 42. Belshazzar put a gold pendant around Daniel's neck for the same reason in Daniel 5, verse 29. By mentioning a pendant, Solomon urged his son to rest in the certainty that God's wisdom would render a life of true honor. Question to consider at this time. In what ways have you experienced God's grace by seeking his wisdom? Consider that. Well, let's look at verses 10 through 12. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood. Let us ambush the innocent without reason. Like Sheol, let us swallow them alive, and whole like those who go down to the pit. Well, here Solomon's compassion and concern for his son resonated in his instruction to avoid the temptation to join a group of bad influencers. For a young person, the temptation to accept this gang's invitation would be difficult to reject. To resist the temptation, his son would need to determine ahead of time he would turn down such an invitation before he received it. Good instruction. In Solomon's appeal to his son, he described these gang members as sinners. They had rejected God's ways and had embraced a life aimed only at pleasing themselves. It's all about me. Sounds too awful familiar even in today's society. They just wanted to have fun. They just wanted to recruit people to join them in it. Their recruiting efforts could be extremely persuasive. Anyone who would lend an ear, to their enticing appeal could be persuaded to follow them. Their invitation would be brimming with the promise of excitement and adventure. To help his son reject the gang's invitation, Solomon described it in vivid detail, preparing him for what they would say. Being acquainted with their enticing invitation in advance would prepare the son well. He would be in a better position to resist the invitation when he heard from it from one of the gang members. The notion of setting an ambush for someone passing by would have a devilish charm to it. To these thugs, murdering a person wouldn't be viewed as a crime. Instead, it would be the source of an emotionally powerful rush. For them, killing the innocent would be a way to have fun. They would say that murdering someone would be like swallowing them alive. That privilege had only been reserved for Sheol, the abode of the dead. The thugs would go on to boast that they would swallow someone whole in the same way that the pit, an open grave, would gulp down a corpse. Verses 13 and 14. We shall find all precious goods. We shall fill our houses with plunder. Throw in your lot among us. We will all have one purse. Well, in Solomon's continued preparation of his son, he addressed another persuasive element in the gang's invitation. They would say that murdering an innocent person would be a way to gain wealth. Gang members would defy God by snuffing out the life only he had the authority to take. At the same time, they would also feed their greed. Any young person who pondered the possibilities of getting rich and getting rich quick would have a tough time turning down such an invitation. They could imagine the precious goods they would accumulate without having to work for it. Neither would they have to wait for it, rather. Their homes would soon be filled with the wealth that came from property they would steal from people they murdered. The gang would add that their invitation came with a guarantee. Anyone who accepted it could count on the integrity of murderers and thieves to keep their word. They would promise that every gang member would get a fair share of the loot. Questions to consider. Why would anyone accept such an invitation? Also, what does the invitation say about the way that sin works in a person's life? Consider that. Bad companions in the book of Proverbs. They are considered those who entice you into sin. Chapter 1, verses 10 through 19, verses 24, verse 1. They're called fools, verses 13 through 20, and 13, verse 20, and chapter 14, verse 7. They're called gossips, chapter 20, verse 19. They're called those who drink too much and gluttons in chapter 23, verses 20 and 21. They're also called rebellious people, chapter 24, verse 21. All these are descriptions of bad companions or bad company in the book of Proverbs. Well, let's look at verses 15 and 16. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Hold back your foot from their paths, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. Well, Solomon encouraged his son to resist the temptation to go along with gang members who would try to recruit him. They chose to walk a foolish way they considered to be thrilling. The adventure would give them opportunities to kill and to steal property that didn't belong to them. It sounded to them like something that could be entertaining and fun, but as Solomon pointed out, that road wouldn't take them where they wanted them to go. For that reason, his son would be wise if he determined not to give their offer any consideration at all. Getting on the road would start with one step, so Solomon urged his son never to even take that first step. Verses 17 and 18. For in vain is a net spread in the sight of any bird, but these men lie in wait for their own blood. They set an ambush for their own lives. The saying about the bird and the net might be a little difficult to interpret at first. Now, some Bible students interpret it to mean that a bird may be watching the person who's trying to spread a net. The bird sees that the net being spread would stay away from the grain that's lying on the ground inside it. Other Bible scholars point to the fact that the birds get trapped because they can only see the grain, but they don't even notice the net. Well, taken either way, the picture of the bird and the net point to the outcome for individuals who ignore God. They take the path of selfish indulgence in which others pay a high price for their enjoyment. When they follow such a foolish path, they don't notice the deep, deadly trap that's been set for them by their evil behavior. It's not visible at first. In fact, it only comes into view the moment they fall into it. In the shadows, they waited quietly for the chance to ambush others, but end up being ambushed themselves by their own actions. They set out to attack others so they can kill them, but their actions cost them their own lives. They become trapped by their own plots to kill somebody else. This is the admonishment given by Solomon here. Verse 19. Such are the ways of everyone who is greedy for unjust gain. It takes away the life of its possessors. Well, no wonder Solomon tried to warn his son about the path foolish people would take when greed consumed them. Their greed would guide their hands to take anything they wanted, even if they got it dishonestly. They would always be looking around for the opportunities to profit from the valuables they could take from someone else. Greedy for more, they would stop short of nothing so that they could have what they craved. Greed has plagued God's people in ancient Israel. In response, God used his prophets to hold them accountable. For instance, Ezekiel pointed to the greed of God's people as he confronted them with the sins that had led them into captivity. You see that in Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 27. Habakkuk also had to confront God's people for their sinful actions that had been fostered by their greedy ways. See that in Habakkuk 2, verses 6 through 12. Dishonest prophet destroyed the greedy people who got their hands on it. I'll say that again. Dishonest prophet destroyed the greedy people who got their hands on it. Ignoring God's wisdom still puts a person's life in jeopardy. For that reason, mature Christians eagerly seek his wisdom through his word. We want to please him and not ourselves. For that reason, we reject greed. Final question to consider. How can the Lord use you to warn someone about such a self-destructive path? Good question to consider. The key doctrine they want us to think about and consider in the lesson is basically man. Only the grace of God can bring people into his holy fellowship and enable them to fulfill his creative purpose of God. That's found in 1 Corinthians 12, verses 21 through 31. Well, as we begin the study in Proverbs, I'm going to offer a challenge to you. I haven't done this previously, but I'm going to do it now. Proverbs has 31 chapters. There are normally 30 to 31 days in a month. For the next 3 months, read at least a chapter a day and repeat it each month. And see what God does in your life. I'm going to do the same for myself. In times we currently live, we need as much wisdom from God as we can get. So please join us next week as we continue this summer study. Let's pray, we'll be closed. Father, again, thank you for the Proverbs you've given us here through your word. Thank you for using Solomon to write them. By the power of your Holy Spirit, I pray we would apply what we hear and learn to our lives, and we take the wisdom we hear seriously, because it's your wisdom and your instruction to us for godly living. These things we ask in your name. Amen. Good to be with you again as we start the study of Proverbs. Look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.